Day class, let us now discuss the third lesson of lesson 8, which is talking about communication. In this lesson, we are going to tackle all about the principles of communication. What are the essential components or what are the essential concepts when we talk about principles of communication? So make sure that you have with you your notebooks and jot down the most important or salient points of this discussion in order for you to comprehend better the lesson that we are going to have for today. So with that being said, let's begin with this general context that I would like you to take note. Miscommunication and confusion can be avoided when one follows the principles of communication. I believe everybody can agree with this when we identify later on what are the different principles of communication that will help us avoid miscommunication that ultimately brings forth confusion. Now, in this lesson, we have the following as our learning objectives. First is to identify the principles of communication and apply the principles of communication into our everyday lives. Now, with that being said, I want you to take down the most important lessons or questions that may arise during our discussion so that we may be able to answer them during our online discussions. Now, for this lesson, here is our most essential question. What is the relevance of the principles of communication to everyday conversations? Since it is given that we communicate every day, whether be it verbal or non-verbal, what is the relevance of the principles of communication to everyday conversations? Now, in this regard, we are now going to talk about the principles of communication, the general points, the general concepts, and how this can be applied into context. Now, when we talk about principles of communication, we need to remember that communication is a two-way process. That is the most common, the most common denominator when we talk about the idea of communication as a discipline. Principles of communication leads to essentials to achieve effective communication. Which, with that being said, by understanding and knowing the different principles of communication, this now becomes, or these concepts or principles becomes essential now to achieving effective communication. With that being said, upon achieving effective communication, we are able to avoid conflict, miscommunication, misunderstandings, confusion, and misinterpretation of the message that is being conveyed. Now, we are going to discuss one by one the different principles of communication identified by our lesson. First, let's talk about the principle of clarity. Now, let's take note that in the communication process, there is always the message, which needs to be understandable and recognizable by the receiver. Meaning to say, in the principle of clarity, the message needs to be the center point of being understandable and recognizable by the receiver. That means the sender may adjust to the level of comprehension of the receiver. So if you're talking to students, then the level of comprehension that is directed to the receiver, or in this case, the students, should be in accordance with their understanding, with their language being used, or how they are able to recognize the message that is being conveyed. If ang imuha pong mga kaistorya is professionals or are professionals, then you should also be able to determine the type of message that is, number one, understandable and recognizable by professionals in specific fields. Now, with that being said, this also conforms to the second principle, the principle of attention. This means that the sender and the receiver should focus on the communication process. That also includes that both must listen and pay attention to each other. Given that communication is a two-way process, there should also be a focus on that particular process, that both the sender and the receiver must pay attention, must be focused on both or on each other, with each other. In talking about principles of attention, this helps us avoid missed detail of the message and avoids misinterpretation when we are not focused. So it is very important that we are focused, no, in the process, in the communication process, so that we are not going to miss any important detail of the message and may lead to misinterpreting the message that is being conveyed. Another is principle of feedback. There is a very important context when we talk about the principle of feedback. This is boiled down into one word, which is reaction. The reaction of the receiver to the message of the sender. This includes the message here, the context of the message here includes the gesture, the answer, the question, or the evaluation. Take note that the principle of feedback is necessary for clarification and ensure understanding. Another principle is the principle of informality. It is necessary when the communication process needs an environment that is relaxed and friendly. This is commonly observed when we are with our friends, when we just talk casually with people that we are very comfortable with. So there is now that environment of being relaxed and friendly. This also changes the tone of the voice to a more friendly one. It adjusts the choice of words that will fit to the receiver of the message. Again, we are going to level the manner of communicating with regards to the people or the receiver that we are going to be having a conversation. Now, another principle is the principle of consistency. This means that the repetition of message should not be altered. Okay, consistent man, then there should also be a consistency in the delivery, right? Or the repetition of the message. This can be observed in the campaign period during these times of the election in the Philippines. Dagan kayo sa mga candidates are bringing forth into light the different platforms and programs that they have in mind in order for the community to resort to progressive solutions after the dreadful pandemic. So that means that with the message with the platforms and programs being repeated from time to time from every place that they go or visit, that meaning or the meaning of that message should not be altered. Kailangan dili pa usab-usab. Kung unsa ang imuhang mensahe nga gihatag sa pundok sa tao, nga imong gikaistorya, that should be the same message that will be repeated across the different communities that you're going to visit, given how vast and how little the world becomes because of social media, which is a very good and effective medium of communication. Principle of consistency also talks about the different or inconsistent meaning of the messages that ultimately results in confusion and misinterpretations. Something that is being avoided by people that are having a structured process or a structured flow of how an output is going to be materialized or is going to be achieved. Another principle of communication is the principle of timeliness. This talks about the message must be delivered, created, produced, written, or spoken about at a favorable time. One example of these are breaking news that are brought to us by different news outlets. It should be relevant to the essence of time, a favorable time. Meaning to say, when you are going to deliver a message, create, produce, write, or speak about a particular message, it should be relevant or timeable. Given that the time that you're going to convey that particular message is still accurate or relevant to the happening of that event or that message that you're trying to convey. Lastly is the principle of adequacy. This means that the message that you're going to convey should be complete, satisfactory, and sufficient. Meaning to say, walang labis, walang kulang. This avoids too little or too much details. That is why the term fake news is being created, because the messages that we are sending out these times of the pandemic, of the election season, and so many other crises is not complete, not satisfactory, and not sufficient because there is no attention to avoiding little or much details. Meaning to say, ginakuhaan o ginadungagan ang mga particular nga mga messages. Now, with that being said, I would like now to try to wrap up this brief discussion of the principles of communication. In that sense, we are going to be able to understand better what communication is talking about or what are these different principles of communication. Now, with that in mind, it is very important that we remember or we understand these principles of communication because for the communication process to be effective, it is important that the principles of communication are followed. What are these principles? These are the following: the principle of clarity, attention, feedback, informality, consistency, timeliness, and adequacy. With these principles of communication in mind, there is no way or it is impossible for messages to come across with confusion or misinterpretation. Hence, a more objective approach that is comfortable to the receiver and from the sender will be achieved in this process of communication because we are observing it and we are basing it from the different principles of communication that we have just discussed. Now, with that being said, what are the most important points of the discussion that made sense to you more compared to the other principles of communication that we have discussed? What do you think is the most important principle of communication that should be emphasized by the sender and the receiver at all costs during the process of communication? Jot them down so that we can talk about it during our discussions online.